What is up, everybody? This is Jay, aka Multimedia Jay, and we've got a lot of stuff to talk about, at the center of which is a little game you may have heard of called Final Fantasy XIV. This is my OG Final Fantasy XIV copy that I picked up in 2010 when the original game came out, and I still have it for some reason or for whatever reason. It is completely useless except as evidence that I've been playing the game on and off since 1.0. So, I don't know if you need any gamer credibility or whatnot. Can I get it in the shot without it falling off the desk? The answer to that, of course, is maybe. If I keep the drinks off to the side, maybe I can. Yeah. There is currently a little fad going on, and it is nothing that surprises me. There's a little fad that's going on right now where disgruntled WoW streamers who are upset about the direction Shadowlands has gone in with patch 9.1 and whatever. I mean, I can't really say I know hardly anything about what happened with WoW. I figured Shadowlands by design would come up short. It looks like, based on all these streamers that are trying out Final Fantasy XIV now, that the execution also came up short as well. You know, it's not just about theoretical intellectual stuff when you're talking about stuff like this. You got to look at how it plays out in the real world. And so with what's going on with WoW versus what's going on with everything else, I really shouldn't be surprised that Blizzard is finding ways to disappoint people with regards to an expansion that we knew from before it came out that Shadowlands was not going to be another ESO. It was not going to be anything that really took big steps. It took steps towards catching up with, say, your Guild Wars 2s and your ESOs and whatnot, and even, to an extent, Final Fantasy XIV. But before Shadowlands launched, I knew that there would be some deficiencies just from the design alone, like the level 49 problem. And these deficiencies would point to the unfortunate reality that Blizzard has a ton of ingrained narcissism within their culture. They have shown again and again and again, I've seen this on the forums even with the Blues, and the ways that they've handled their own customer base, which is why the issue with Asmongold this weekend doesn't surprise me. But I've seen Blues on the forums get so snooty with their customer base that it makes you wonder how they can even launch a successful product. Because there are two ways to tell the world that you're out of touch. Number one is to actually say it. Number two is to have your actions reflect on that. Blizzard has done the latter a lot. What's going on with Final Fantasy XIV does not surprise me. And it is not the first time that this has happened. This is a cyclical thing that persistently happens at least once every few years. Whenever Blizzard isn't doing a good job with WoW, Final Fantasy becomes the anti-WoW. It becomes the game that people think is the most wonderful thing in the world because they don't like WoW. But if you actually play the game and you compare it to ESO, Guild Wars 2, even Star Wars The Old Republic, you find out very, very quickly that a lot of people have convinced themselves that they are going to like this game no matter what because they don't like something else, and that something else is usually World of Warcraft. Design-wise, systems-wise, generations-wise, Final Fantasy XIV plays it safe. There are a lot of things, despite Naoki Yoshida and his dedication to this game, and how much they've brought it back from the mess that was the OG version 1.0 launch. Final Fantasy XIV continues to have a lot of things in it where Square Enix does not go far enough because they play it safe way too much. There are times when, if you've played WoW for a long time, playing this game will remind you of some kind of previous expansion. The last time I tried playing Final Fantasy on a regular basis, The Zerg mentality in the dungeons reminded me of the way dungeons were run in Wrath of the Lich King, which is one of the big reasons why Blizzard turned around and did a lot of nerfs when Cataclysm launched, because it turned into this giant race because people were grinding dungeons. They far out geared everything, and they would blow through the heroics to get their seals of whatever, the currency at the time, justice badges or whatever it was way the heck back then in Lich King days. And nobody really cared about what was going on. The powerful story of going to Northrend to take down the Lich King was lost in the details of all the grinding people were doing, grinding Nax, grinding Ulduar, grinding heroics, grinding dailies, grinding, and what could have been an MMO with a powerful story took a hit, among other things, because of its own mechanics. And to see a situation... So, there's a special system in Final Fantasy for identifying new players and returning players. I want to be able to deliberately group with all new players whenever I want. There should be a toggle for that. So that way, I don't get the ants and pants people grinding the daily duty roulette who want to blow through the dungeon as quickly as possible like it's Lich King. So, and raiders especially, when they're just doing dailies and whatnot, they will blast through it. Sometimes you'll feel like you're kind of being carried because they'll have it down ice cold, and anybody who doesn't gets them all upset. There are really... you need to know when you're going into a dungeon in Final Fantasy that you're not going to get a bunch of essentially speedrunners who are going to be very angry at you if you don't have the routine down ice cold, which means you don't play as much as they do. It's a more extreme version of what happened with casuals versus hardcores in Wrath of the Lich King. But again, references to Wrath of the Lich King. World of Warcraft moved on from that nonsense. Final Fantasy didn't. It's one of the reasons why I play the game from time to time. But in terms of being an MMO that you have like you live another life in, so to speak, because you play it so much. The way I play ESO with my characters and player housing and getting wrapped up in all the systems, and even when I take a break from the game, letting the subscription continue because I get crowns every month. Final Fantasy has never succeeded in getting me to do that. It is always a game that I walk away from, stay away for a while, then come back, play for a while, and the cycle just keeps repeating. And one of those reasons is because of the design decisions in this game. So, the upfront, as one boss I used to have many years ago put it, the CNN headline version of what we're going to talk about here is this. Any WoW player who thinks that Final Fantasy XIV is amazing, the first question you need to answer is, do they think that Final Fantasy is good because for some reason they think World of Warcraft is bad? Because literally, whether it's the nonsense that's going on now, the nonsense that was going on in Warlords of Draenor, I mean, you can just pick a time in WoW history when WoW players were angry at their own game. There have been people, especially YouTubers, who have talked about Final Fantasy like it was the most amazing thing ever, and it is not. Final Fantasy is actually behind the 8 ball in several design choices with regards to how the game works. It is very dated in some very critical areas. And the other stuff where the game does really well covers up all of that in people's minds. They love the fact that they can have a pretty chocobo house and they can play a cat lady or now Viera, the bunny ladies and whatnot, and go around and do all kinds of glamours and all kinds of other things, armor dyes, being fashionable, socialize, role play, do custom screenshots with custom poses because there's a special screenshot mode in the game. There are a lot of things that Final Fantasy does incredibly, incredibly well, and people, because of those things, will not acknowledge what this game does incredibly, incredibly bad. Classic fanboyism, ladies and gentlemen. I know that term has fallen out of favor, but it still probably has some SEO out there somewhere. You're talking about people who will blindly say that something's good and not look at it objectively. And in the case of these WoW players, you have people that will blindly say that something is good because they dislike something else. And this must be better because I can't forget where I came from, blah, 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 blah. Let's talk about Final Fantasy, and let's actually revisit an old blog entry that I posted back in 2013. So Final Fantasy right now it is incredibly popular to like Final Fantasy because there's a lot of things people don't like about WoW. This is not the first time I've seen this happen. Seen this happen all throughout the 2010s, and it has to be the 2010s because this game came out in 2010. So, Final Fantasy, this game is the reason why I built Tuxedo. I was running perfectly fine with a Core 2 Duo many years ago when this game first came out. And I thought it was cool that there was a game out there where there's a game out there where you could change your class just by changing your weapon. That was pretty cool. Although it does have some problems, as I blogged about a little later on. So I played the OG Final Fantasy XIV. It ran badly. I was like, oh crap, my computer's getting old. Let me build a new system. So I did. It ran badly. Didn't occur to me that the game was as bad as it really was. Did not run well at all. It came out later that there were lots of screwball decisions made, like, for example, texture resolutions on really small objects being way too high, among many, many other things that made this game run like complete garbage in its version 1.0 days. Here I was getting one of the best processors that AMD had to offer in 2010, the Phenom 2 1090Ti. I was out there getting the best processor, one of the best AMD processors I could get to run this game. Wasn't enough. And this was 2010 when this game came out that all this happened. So, we know from more recent history with the Delosaurus and everything that if I had waited one more year and I had built a system with an Intel Sandy Bridge, things would have gone a lot better. The Sandy Bridges were a lot more refined than their AMD competition at the time. So I've actually, with the Delosaurus, found out what I've been missing all these years. If I'd gotten an AMD, or if I got an Intel i7 2600, not even the K version, could have gotten the K version, just from the 2600 alone, I probably could still be using that to play games now. I could probably still be using that to play video games right now. And I'll be looking to get rid of it because Windows 11 requires all the security stuff. So I'd be making a pretty big jump to get a better CPU. And the next step for the Delosaurus experiment for me is to take the Delosaurus and Delosaurus Rex and answer all of the what-if questions about many, many things related to the shortages that are all over the place. Delosaurus Rex has an upgraded power supply, so you can shoehorn in the 1060 that I used to have. So you can put a graphics card besides 1050 Ti in that thing and see how good it could have been. And for the Sandy Bridge, I want to put the 1050 Ti in there as an example of the kind of system you can get now if you don't want to get ripped off by you'll get ripped off on the graphics card because you'll spend more than $100 on a 1050 Ti. But if you had that, what can it do? That's the question I want to answer with the tech videos. Final Fantasy is going to be part of that. But this game right here is the reason why I had Tuxedo. 1090Ti Phenom 2 system. If I hadn't been trying to get this game running back in 2010, I probably could have gone Sandy Bridge. i7 Sandy Bridge or i5 Sandy or whatever, probably i7. And what I have with Monolith would have happened in 2011 instead of 2016, where I know that an Intel processor is more refined of a product and it scales down power-wise a lot better than the AMD competition at the time did. This game, as far as I'm concerned, is single-handedly responsible for one of the biggest hardware blunders I've ever done with computers, and that is going AMD for Tuxedo. Yeah, sure, it lasted for several years until I destabilized the motherboard from too much overclocking, but I think, looking back on it all, that I would have gotten far better results if I'd gone Sandy Bridge. And it was all because of this game. If this game had gotten delayed into 2011, I might have built a Sandy Bridge system to run it when it ran poorly on my Core 2 Duo. So myself in this game, we go way back. When the game was redone from scratch for Realm Reborn, I went and played it and liked it, but it wasn't the kind of game that would keep me away from World of Warcraft and later ESO. There's a lot of design decisions with Final Fantasy that hold it back. Some of that is because, as Naoki Yoshida has been talking about, especially in some recent articles like what I've been sharing on Twitter, many of the devs in Final Fantasy are fans of Blizzard, and a lot of them have actually have spoken and said up front, hey, we were inspired by what Blizzard did with World of Warcraft. The latest thing that I heard from one of the articles I recently shared on Twitter was Naoki Yoshida talking about, well, yeah, the whole thing with Final Fantasy, this whole thing with Final Fantasy is that we were able to rebuild the game and we were inspired by stuff that WoW was doing. And I can believe that. One problem I've traditionally had with running dungeons in Final Fantasy is you're going to get people that know all the dungeons ice cold, and they're going to get very angry at you if you don't. It is Lich King all over again. Speed run the dungeons to get your daily rewards and grind. So get your daily duty roulette done and stuff like that. But throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s now, one of the most consistent things I've seen with Final Fantasy is that World of Warcraft players will adore this game and say it's so amazing when they don't like what Blizzard's doing. And this is the latest example of that. Blizzard has been annoying people with how long it took for patch 9.1 to come out and what was in patch 9.1 when it finally came out. If you rewind the clock, Warlords of Draenor had the same problem. Lack of content in the patches, and patches taking too long to come out. Content being gated. All that lovely stuff. Too much content that was designed to eat up your time instead of give you a good time, so to speak. Wow. What did I eat tonight that had too much sugar in it? Can barely even speak. But Final Fantasy is the game that you're going to hear all kinds of people saying nice things about when they're mad at something else. And that's the thing. Because when that's your attitude, like we mentioned earlier, when that's your attitude, you ignore the shortcomings of this game. You ignore the areas where Square Enix played it safe. Didn't get audacious enough, and other games did. So, now that we have Avast Secure back in one piece, let's take the bookmarks. There's a bit of a problem I had with Avast Secure earlier, where I had to uninstall the browser. I had to uninstall the browser, and because it was flaking out on my screen all the time. But now that it's back, let's get this scene working again, and let's go in here. So browser, Avast Secure, did not link up because the last time I showed this, it didn't, Avast browser, there it is. So here's something I said about Final Fantasy back in 2013. Now, before I played Final Fantasy 14, I actually played Final Fantasy 11 a bit too, and I had some problems with, it was just, the mechanics were pretty old. About 3 years ago, detective drama, heck with that stuff. Heard about a game that was going to try some radically new things with online RPGs. The game was Final Fantasy. Picked it up shortly after release because it looked very interesting. I'd tried Square Enix's previous attempt at an MMO with Final Fantasy XI and been largely disappointed with first-gen MMO mechanics, such as the game being hard to solo, excessive grinding, and the other clunkiness. Let's make sure we have live control room on there in case it flakes out again. The other clunkiness of Play Online system, including the danger back then of having to repurchase the game if you canceled your subscription the wrong way. So there was a problem where people canceled their Play Online accounts thinking they were canceling the game. And then they found out they had to repurchase the game because they shut down their Play Online account instead of keeping the Play Online account and canceling the service account only. So this kind of things being harder than they should be is something that goes back to Final Fantasy XI. I don't think that's a thing anymore, but back in the day, you had to be careful because your CD key could be invalidated if you deleted the wrong thing when you tried to cancel your subscription. This time it looked like Square was on the ball. Game looked a lot more second-gen MMO than its predecessor, and there was a neat new system where you could change your class just by equipping different weapons, effectively eliminating issues with class rivalry, envy, etc., because one character could play all the classes. If you got bored with one type of class, you could just level another without having to make a new character. Then on top of all of that, the graphics were incredible. Totally awesome, right? Needless to say, it was an... Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention. The OG Final Fantasy XIV looked really good in 2010. Looks terrible today. I mean, even if you run it on maximum, there's a lot of eye candy and visuals. ESO has better graphics than Final Fantasy XIV these days. No, but what Final Fantasy XIV has, it uses really well, which is why you might see some very pretty screenshots from the game. See here. Totally awesome, right? It was an absolute mess. Oh, back in the days when the stick your tongue out emoji didn't look like this. This is an old blog entry. Well, I'm needlessly wasting my October vacation week that year trying to build a new computer to run this game, which you now know as Tuxedo, when in reality my new system couldn't handle the game either, despite having far more high-end components. It was the game, not my rig. Then again, everything that went wrong with that when that game launched was because of the game. Square Enix apologized and announced a relaunch, which we now know as A Realm Reborn, or as we were talking about it on Ada Continues back in the day, Final Fantasy XIV 2. And here was my initial thoughts on Realm Reborn. It's still the latest WoW killer that just doesn't get it. Another so-called WoW killer that reminds me of every time I play of reasons why Blizzard has done so well with WoW over the years. Not the case now, not the case in Warlords of Draenor. This is the Mist of Pandaria era that we're talking about with this, and people nowadays think of Mists as a good expansion. I played a few WoW killers over the years. They all make the same mistake over and over again. They try to be clever at competing with Blizzard without acknowledging that Blizzard has set some standards, and that's one reason why, despite the game's current state of decline, WoW still has an impressive sub-base. This is Mists of Pandaria that we're talking about this. So, let's see here. Flexible weapon-based class system. The two-handed swords. How would two-handed swords be implemented in Eorzea given the current class structure, where, of course, paladins equipped swords? Well, we know they answered that question with Dark Knight. Which class or job would use them and how would it work? So there are three jobs that use swords in Final Fantasy XIV. The type of sword is what separates them. One-handers are for paladins, two-handers are for Dark Knights, and dexterity swords, like fencing swords, are for the Red Mage. Clever. How this class differentiates itself from a Marauder. The you can be anything system is a neat idea, but tying it to weapons causes problems with these kinds of overlapping weapons issues. It also hurts the RP as well. All warriors have to use axes. There is no such thing as a Thor warrior in Eorzea. You can't go around with a two-handed hammer because every weapon needs to be tied to one of the jobs. Oh, look at this. I imagine introducing red mages or blue mages might make Square Enix reconsider this weapons gimmick. They have both nowadays. It sounded cool when the game came out, but now the shortcomings are coming to light, and this system definitely needs a major overhaul, especially if more classic Final Fantasy jobs or classes are going to be added. What weapon will correspond to those classes? Red mages had dexterity swords, and blue mages had canes. That became a weapon. That became a weapon with blue mages. How will it not overlap with the white mages or black mages? These old blog entry, man. Here's something that's gone from the game. The utterly inflexible cross-class system. Yeah, makes no sense lore-wise. Biggest irony of this game is despite trying to bring Final Fantasy to the MMO world again, this game ignores the freelancer job from previous FF games like Final Fantasy V and heavily restricts cross-class abilities, either explicitly or through the stats system. If you want to cast a crappy fire spell as a gladiator to pull mobs, too bad, even if you have high levels of thaumaturge. But the conjurer, on their way to being a white mage, can use the Lancer cooldown to jack up their parry rate for X amount of seconds. This has probably all been removed from the game since then. Cross-class system has some issues with silly things like this, even outside the more restricted job system. Besides the overt restrictions, there are covert ones too. Secondary healing. The gladiator has a high mind stat for whatever reason and can cast somewhat weaker versions of cure. Well, gladiator leads to paladin, so I think this might even be before the job system came out. As I'm talking about the classes a lot. The other melee, forget it. Why? This doesn't even make sense from a lore perspective, because if someone has high levels of Conjurer and then decides to become a pugilist, similar to something like the healer monks from WoW, why would they suddenly be stupid at healing just because they changed their weapon? See here. Yeah, load times between areas, Well, that gets in the way nowadays when it comes to flight in the game and the way flight works. So you'll hit invisible walls when you unlock your flying mounts. So it's just these old design choices that have come back to cause problems later on in this game. See, I detest how the major cities are split in half, so just going from one part of the city to another without leaving the city includes a load time. Earth to Square Enix, PS1 and its infamous load times was nearly 20 years ago now. There have been some other changes as well. Lame movement restrictions. The invisible walls and inability to swim are immersion killers. Swimming has been added to the game in certain areas. Especially some of the game's gorgeous visuals. I might as well play a persistent world Neverwinter Nights 2. Yeah, well, Neverwinter Nights 2 has the exact same problem. You can't go into the water. It's literally just D&D, land only, that kind of stuff. The only water you can move through is ankle-deep streams. Yeah, cross the river in the Gridanian forest, and it's all ankle-deep water, and the fish are floating above the water. Yeah, that was dumb. Skyrim does this stuff better. That game's not even online. When looking at some of the nice oceanfront scenery in this game, why shouldn't my character be able to go for a swim if there's a nice beach in-game? Costa del Sol. Horrendous in-game maps. This is one of my biggest beefs with this game, is that all this time later, the whole game isn't voiced yet. Oh, man. Today, game after game after game has full voice work, but Final Fantasy doesn't. Let's see. Improved, but not quite there. UI, etc. Dungeon groups, old WoW problems, and worse. They had a dungeon finder system. The way it works is circa Wrath of the Lich King in terms of copying WoW, so forget about getting any decent queue time if you want to play as DPS. No, we can see how it is nowadays. But MMO Trinity nowhere near as pronounced in the game as it is in Blizzard Land. It'd be more than feasible for the system to use and allow non-standard groups. Well, that's there now. Yeah. The economy and the money system. The way money works in the game, you either end up dirt poor and can't afford your repair bills, or you become rich by exploiting other players. Yeah, that's been fixed. Decent chunk of Gladiator, Lancer, Conjurer are my highest levels back then. I only had barely 100 gold because of that. Couldn't even level because of money. That's been fixed a lot. So, audiovisual wise, great presentation. Nods to previous Final Fantasies were a nice touch. Nods to Guild Wars 2 were another nice touch as well. The MMO Trinity being lessened. Today, that's largely only represented the Red Mage with Vercure. Summoners casting Physic is terrible. Final Fantasy game, and it feels like one. It's the biggest theme park out of all of them. Consoles, play it, World of Final Fantasy. I think that's actually a game title now. It's just not this. Yeah. So, proving over. Your Blizzard. It's time to get rid of server queues. Oh, man. So, that is circa November 2013 with regards to Final Fantasy XIV. The biggest issue I run into, though, nowadays, though, is a lot of the toxicity that comes over from WoW gets worse in Final Fantasy XIV. And the way it gets worse is pretty simple. I'm trying to get back to the category here. I have 3 blog entries about Final Fantasy XIV. Why did only one of them show up? Let's see. Let's click something else in the menu because it doesn't seem to be working right now. Switch over to my 2 e-waste articles and then switch back to Final Fantasy XIV. Yeah, so I've run into a lot of the most toxic people I've dealt with are actually Final Fantasy players, more so than WoW. And I think some of this has to do with people get mad at WoW, they go to Final Fantasy, but they don't work on themselves in terms of being better people. So they go over and they get caught up in everything that's going on over there. They get caught up in all the anime and all the other stuff. And they get too emotional about dumb little things. I've run into some people in some free companies I've been involved with in this game that have done a terrible, terrible job of dealing with their own personal problems, and they seem to think they would always find sympathy when they logged into the game, even if the drama they caused would break up the guild, so to speak. So there's been some UI issues over the years and things along those lines, like, for example, when there was more gold spamming, there wasn't a way to report spam and things like that. But by and large, the big thing we got to remember with Final Fantasy is what we talked about early on. I think that's probably the best iteration of this discussion that we've had. People will like this game because they dislike something else. And because of that, they won't look at this game on its own merits, and they will also not acknowledge where this game comes up short. So where does it come up short? Talked about a couple of things related to that. The MMO Trinity, the restrictions on movement, the game feeling closer to Neverwinter Nights than ESO or WoW in terms of how connected the landmasses are and everything. Things that affect immersion and things along those lines. There's some other decisions, too, that have been made with regards to adding flight to the old zones where you can't land anywhere that's not like authorized space. Or how about, for example, if you have a mount, you can fly over gaps that you hit an invisible wall if you try to jump over and things like that. There's lots of dumb little details that basically mean that Square Enix has played it safe with this game. And quite frankly, with how other companies like Blizzard have sometimes made themselves look bad by trying new things that didn't work. I mean, entrepreneurialism is cool and all, but when you have a bunch of people, they've developed an expectation of what to expect from this game that they're playing and enjoying. To have you suddenly change all of that just to try something new fundamentally leads to this mentality that does anything stick around anymore? You think, like, for example, what happened in Legion with the artifact weapons, and then BFA had something similar happen. If you have systems that you know are going away at the end of the expansion, how does that make you feel like you're getting anywhere? When Blizzard could wake up one morning and say, we're completely deprecating this old system in this patch or at the end of this expansion or whatnot. So the feeling of being anything significant is a feeling that matters with these MMOs. Because it's really, I mean, a lot of the enjoyment that comes from them, as opposed to playing games and beating them like single-player games, is this idea of getting involved in this other world. If there's little synthetic little gotchas that get in your way, you're not going to get as involved as you otherwise would have. And that's the important thing to remember when it comes to Final Fantasy. There's a lot of little gotchas that show up, a lot of clunkiness, some would even call it spaghetti code nowadays, just because of how the game has developed for the last couple of years. But throughout most of its history, what I'm seeing now with all these big streamers playing Final Fantasy is not something I haven't seen before. Literally every single time people are mad at Blizzard, somebody somewhere on YouTube is saying that Final Fantasy XIV is better than WoW. It's been going on for years. This situation with Asmongold is no exception. So the situation with Asmongold and all these other streamers is no exception. And it's going to keep on happening too. Something you got to keep an eye on as these things continue to happen over and over again as the years drag on. When it's not your first rodeo, you recognize it very, very, very quickly. I can't emphasize that enough. So, in terms of playing this game again, I probably will check it out at some point. I'll probably try and play catch up, but I'm actually bogged down in trying to get my tanks to all the same level. That's one of the big reasons why I couldn't make progress last time. And I still have to play ESO Blackwood that just came out this month, or last month, technically. ESO Blackwood came out, so I got to check that out, see what's going on with the Leowen and the Oblivion thing. I spent a lot of time going through all 18 characters in ESO and getting access to those first two companions. So probably too much time. I should have been playing the main story in there. But yeah, the Final Fantasy fad that's going on right now, nothing exciting. It's nothing that hasn't happened before. It's nothing that won't happen ever again. It will happen. It absolutely will happen again later on. So yeah, I'm going to check out and see what's been going on, see what the hubbub's about. Maybe see if I can make some progress and whatnot. But I definitely want to play some ESO as well. But by and large, look, Evaluate games on their own merits. This applies to game review videos, by the way. Don't formulate your opinion 100% based on someone else's opinion. Look at each game on its own merits, whether it's Final Fantasy, whether it's ESO, whether it's Guild Wars 2, which, by the way, there was a recent announcement that there's going to be an opt-in beta for DirectX 11 support. So finally, Guild Wars 2 can move beyond DirectX 9, hopefully get some better frame rates. But I'm going to reiterate as we close what I said on Attic Continues many, many years ago, an old gaming podcast that I used to be a regular guest on. Way back in the early part of the last decade, I talked about how I would love to see a world where the MMO that you play is because of the intellectual property that it is. I talk about how Final Fantasy is the biggest theme park out of theme park MMOs. The biggest reason to like this game is because you like Final Fantasy. It's not that you think WoW is bad. The biggest reason to like Final Fantasy is because you think Final Fantasy is good. If you're going to like this game because you dislike something else, then, okay, enough of this. If you're going to like Final Fantasy because you dislike something else, you're cutting your potential short here. Yeah, you should. It's not always the case that the enemy of your enemy is your friend. So evaluate MMOs on their own merits with regards to whether you like the source material. It's not about this game has this anymore, that game has that feature anymore. They all try their new things. Once upon a time, MMOs consisted of World of Warcraft and everybody trying to be World of Warcraft. Nowadays, there's still quite a bit of that going on. But the other IPs that are in play, like Star Wars The Old Republic, Final Fantasy XIV, Guild Wars 2, ESO, etc., they have their own thing going on. Take ESO, for example. The thing Asmund complained about with, ESO doesn't have a centralized story. Neither did the offline Elder Scrolls games. Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, the main quest was a small part of the game compared to everything you could do if you 100% complete it. And then there was mods that could add more stuff afterwards. Seen some incredibly good quest mods on the 3 offline Elder Scrolls games over the years, some of which could have passed as expansion packs. But that was a design choice for ESO based on what it came from. Some of the things people say, the nice things people say about Final Fantasy, is because of where this game came from. And the fact that initially this was just a blah, WoW, whatever it was in version 1.0 with obvious nods to WoW, but not enough Final Fantasy for people to really like it too much. A Realm Reborn changed all of that, and now they've gone so much in the other direction that the biggest reason to like this game is because you like the franchise, not because you dislike something else. You're really not giving this game a fair shake if you're only playing it because you're mad at Blizzard and you want to play something, so you're going to check out something else while World of Warcraft is terrible. Give these games chances on their own merits. And quite frankly, life is too short to be driven into an entire MMO because of your dislike of a video game. Think about it. You know, I don't know if this happens anymore because I'm older. When I was little, if I got too upset about a video game, the parents would bust into the room and say, "It's only a game." Somewhere along the line, we lost that with the way people flip out on the internet about these games. And I don't know what it's going to take for that kind of level-headed approach to things to come back. Less yapping, more gaming. That's where we're going to leave this discussion. Final Fantasy XIV. It's popular now, but the reason why it's gotten popular among these streamers is nothing we haven't seen before, and we will see it again. Just give it time for Blizzard or someone to mess something up. We'll see this come roaring back if these people all play it this summer and then go away. I mean, if Final Fantasy becomes this year's Among Us in terms of all the streamers are playing it all summer long and then suddenly it's like, what? Nothing unusual. That kind of fad stuff happens on Twitch. and in gaming in general. Remember in 2012 with Guild Wars 2, as well as Elder Scrolls with that stuff, every game suddenly had to have a huge dragon. It's happened before, can happen again. Either way. I'm going to check this out. Check out ESO Blackwood. I've had the expansion. I haven't even gotten a chance to play it. Not going to stream it because I want the initial experience of the game, as we saw with Asmon and all the people following him everywhere. I want my initial experience of a game to not be soured by anything stream related, including minor details like wearing gaming headphones or these instead of just sitting back in the chair and enjoying the brand new video game. I wonder about that with some of these streamers, by the way. Do they realize there's a difference between streaming and getting the actual real experience of the game? So if you've done playthroughs of various games and whatnot, you actually aren't getting the experience you would otherwise get if you played through on your own. So you have to balance, depending on the size of your stream, is it really worth it to give up what could be you enjoying a new video game in order to stream it for your first run through, your first time through, and have to deal with backseat gamers, stream snipers, the whole 9 yards? Something to think about. Either way, I'm going to practice what I preach. Play some stuff off, play some stuff. Yeah, play some games offline. I do have a tech video to work on, and I have others to work on as well. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.